The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Good evening and welcome to the Ask Your Lawyer show. I am your host, Tyra Iqbal of Liberty Law Solicitors. And with me in the studio today is the legendary Leslie Manley of Church Court Chambers. For those of you that do not know, Leslie is a highly experienced barrister at Church Court Chambers, and she specialises in criminal and civil law cases. We also have joining us for the first time on the Ask Your Lawyer show, Amina Karim. Amina is a bar student, and she also works as a junior editor of GC Legal magazine. Welcome to the show, guys.
It's great to be here.
And thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having us.
So, in light of the recent A-level results on the 15th of August, we thought that it would be a really good idea to discuss careers, specifically legal careers, and the different routes into law for all of you that are interested. And you're actually quite lucky today because we have obviously a fully qualified barrister with years of experience. And we also have Amina, who's currently studying at the bar. So you have, different ends of the spectrum, and you get to get a good insight into what it's like for each of them. So that's not at all, actually. In the second half of the show, we're going to be discussing an important topic about consent. So as defense lawyers, the issue of consent is something that we deal with time and time again. It is a difficult subject matter, but it is an important concept in law which affects everyone in society. But we'll have more of that in the second half of the show. So for now, careers, let's just start with the basics, really. I'll start with you, Amina. Have you always wanted to pursue a legal career?
I think it was always between history and law. They just ended up being subjects that I was quite good at. And then I kind of decided on law with the help of my family. They were like, it might be easier to get a job if you do a straight law degree. And I guess it kind of worked out. So
nice. Okay. And you, Leslie, have you always been interested in pursuing a legal career?
My first thought of a career actually was to be a primary school teacher.
Really?
Yes, because when I was at school, my primary school, I just enjoyed it so much. Everything from doing artwork to story time. The first teacher that really inspired me to read us The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
Oh.
And so the idea of going into a magical world, so I was really loved that, and that was what I thought actually I would do. When I was doing general studies A-level, we went to Preston Crown Court and saw a real live trial. And that was really the first time that I thought, oh, this is something that I might enjoy, and also something that I thought actually maybe I can do, because when you see things on the television, it's very different from seeing a real life trial. So that was really my first time of thinking I'd like to be in the law.
In the law. Interesting. And what was your route into law? I'll start with you, Amina.
Okay.
So you're just starting out, sort of at the beginning of your career path. What has been your route so far?
So we didn't have law as an option in school, in high school, but I took law as an A-level, and then I did a straight law degree. Then I did the combined masters and the BPTC, which is the bar professional training course, in order to be a barrister. So yeah, I'm doing that right now.
So you're currently studying that. Cool. And you, Leslie?
I began by reading an English degree, English language and literature. And also when I'd left school, because I loved reading, I worked in the library because I thought that would let me read all day. But in fact, it didn't. I had to do things like shelve books and things like that. So I then, once I got my degree, I did the common professional exam in law, where you do 6 core subjects. Then I did the bar course, and then I did a year's training pupillage, which Amina will know and you know, but for those people who don't know, that's a year's practical training where you are supervised by a barrister for the first 6 months. You don't do any of your own cases. You follow the person to court. You do paperwork for them and help them, hopefully. But the main thing is that you learn. And then in the next 6 months, you're still supervised, but you get to go to court yourself and do your own cases. So that was my route to law.
Okay, so you mentioned having to do a course with the 6 core subjects. Is that known as a GDL now, the Graduate Diploma in Law? Is that slightly different?
I'm really not sure. It might be the same thing. It's for people.
So.
Is it?
Yeah.
So it's for people who haven't
Read law as an undergrad,
yes, and so then you do 6 essential subjects that you've got to know.
Mm-hmm. And you are a barrister and you want to be a barrister, right? So both of you are interested in that aspect of law. What made you decide to become a barrister instead of a solicitor?
I think when I was younger, I was quite good at talking myself out of trouble. So my mum always said that I would be a good barrister. And I think that's what appealed to me most. I really like the advocacy side, being in front of, a lot of people and just getting to talk and argue.
Yeah.
It really appealed to me.
And you, Leslie?
Well, very similar reasons. The only difference is that when I qualified, you couldn't do Crown Court trials unless you became a barrister. Oh. And I was really fascinated by criminal law and Crown Court trials. Now, of course, you can be a solicitor advocate and do Crown Court trials. So really that was the reason I chose that route rather than to be a solicitor.
Right, okay. And so for our listeners that don't actually know, what is the difference between a solicitor, a barrister, and a solicitor advocate?
Well, nowadays there's much more of a crossover in roles. Many countries have what's called a fused profession. So if, for instance, you are a barrister in Gibraltar, you will do the work of a solicitor as well here. There's differences because of different areas of law. But I would say, generally speaking, the solicitor generally has the initial contact with the client, and the barrister, whether it be in crime or copyright or whatever it is, generally has the more specialist area. That's not always so, because as you've mentioned, there is solicitor advocates now, and you have people working from solicitors' offices who will also go to the county court or Crown Court every day. So the roles are less clearly that's right, they overlap a lot more now than they used to. Again, when I started, you couldn't be a judge unless you were a barrister, whereas that's not the case now either. So yes, things overlap a lot more than they used to.
Okay. And if somebody did want to become a solicitor advocate, are you aware of what other course they would need to do in order to qualify as a solicitor advocate?
I think you need to complete some sort of advocacy training, and then there's a few more additional core exams.
Yes, yeah. So
okay, cool. So Leslie, you're also an approved pupil supervisor and an advocacy trainer at Middle Temple, and you have taught for over 15 years. What exactly do you teach, and what does this entail?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it was a great opportunity for me to be able to teach with the Inn, because the porter once said, as I was going in late at night, he said, well, this is your chance to give back a little bit of what you were given. So it did seem strange, really, that having gone there as a very young woman in my 20s, and now I'm actually teaching there. But what it entails is that you yourself are trained, that you're not just allowed to go in and involve yourself with the students and tell them what you think of their advocacy. It used to be thought that you couldn't teach advocacy, that people had to go to court to pick it up and then learn by experience and so forth. People know now that that's not the case, and that you can be taught advocacy and people can make very real and dramatic improvements. What happened with me is that I got taught by many times Queen's Counsel how to teach, and it's a particular method called the Hampel method.
Ooh, what is the Hampel method?
Well, I'm going to say this all incorrectly now. You identify something that the person has maybe not got quite right.
Okay.
So that could be something serious or something less serious. Like a lot of people, they use what's called fillers. So if they get nervous, they fill in by saying but that's a very common thing. And so you then replay the situation for them yourself, with them not doing that, and then get them to do it. And that's just a very basic example. But the exercises are generally all advocacy exercises, bail applications, examinations in chief, cross-examination, speeches.
Yeah.
They are written by Bernard Richmond, who's Queen's Counsel. And so all groups have the same material. And so what happens is you go in after court if you're available, and if they need you, you're assigned a group. But you very rarely get the same group twice. They rotate. Okay. So that the idea is that they get the benefit of different people. And also we get monitored. So if I'm teaching, someone will come in, keep an eye on me, and make sure that I'm doing the best I can for those people. So that's what the teaching involves. Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. And Amina, as a bar student, have you had any advocacy training yet? Or...
Yes. So I think we had 4 core modules to do with advocacy: examination in chief, cross-examination, and then we had civil submissions as well. Sorry, that's 3. And then within that, we had opening and closing speeches. But we actually used the technique that you were talking about. So at uni, they used to record us. Mm-hmm. So prior to that, they would give us case papers and a task. So we had to cross-examine a defendant about whether he committed an attack or not, or something like that. And then they would kind of outline what questions you were allowed to use, and we would replay it back, and they would outline what we did wrong or what we could improve on. And then we found ourselves bettering ourselves like every week. Yeah. So it did work, yeah.
That's really good. And what would you say, studying the course, and obviously you studied the course, Leslie, what would you say has been the most difficult aspect for you personally, or the most challenging aspect into becoming a barrister or studying the BPTC?
Well, I think for me, there were a number of issues. The first one really was what everybody, unless you're really lucky, struggles with, is the financial aspect. Yeah. It's really a challenge. When I came to study, I was really fortunate because Lancashire County Council gave me a grant to do the bar course, which would not happen nowadays. But otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do that. But I did have to come to London because it was the only bar school. And of course, when I'd been up north at university, you can live reasonably well on, your holiday jobs, evening jobs, and your grant. To come to London was really a financial challenge for me. I was very lucky because another person who was coming down, in fact, from Newcastle, she got a housing association place that we shared accommodation, and it was not the commercial rent. So we were so fortunate. Otherwise, that would have been a very, very real obstacle. Yeah.
Are you aware of if there is any funding in place now for people that are interested in studying the bar course but don't necessarily have the financial means?
There are a few scholarships, aren't there, offered by INS. And the thing is, when you're applying for student finance, when it comes to postgrad courses, which aren't masters, you won't get funding for it. So that's why a lot of bar schools now, they offer kind of integrated masters where you get, I think it's 10 grand. But most London bar courses are about 20 grand. So you have to find that 10 grand from somewhere, the remaining 10 grand, which is quite difficult.
Well, my son is currently doing a combined LPC and masters, and I think that's how he managed to get the loan that he's got.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm the other part of his loan. It's because I'm really aware that it was a challenge for me, but for people coming through now, it really is very difficult. The one other thing that's changed is that when I was training, you were limited as to what you could work as. Mm-hmm. You couldn't just think, well, I'll get an evening job or Saturday job or whatever. It had to be approved. Whereas now I think that those days are gone, and I'm sure if you wanted to work in a shop on a Saturday or something like that, you'd be allowed to. But it was very much more rigid back then. So there were good things like getting the grant, but there were much more rigid structures around everything. So
also, I think the ratio to do with scholarships and people applying for bar courses, they're so low in, the amount of people that apply and how many are given out every year.
Yes, I mean, I was on Twitter recently and I saw that Middle Temple are doing their best to give scholarships out, and particularly to try to assist with social mobility, because one cannot deny that the economics is an obstacle in getting people from a diverse backgrounds to get qualified properly. Yes. So
speaking on that's okay. Speaking on diversity, how diverse would you say members of the bar are now compared to how they used to be? Have you seen a change, or would you say that not much change has actually been made and it's still very much the same?
I think that there are a lot of progress has been made. A lot of progress has been made. For example, when I came to London from the north, people would comment on my accent and say I couldn't possibly be a barrister because of the way I spoke, and hadn't I better quickly go off to Manchester or something like that. Being a woman was very difficult. I was in a chambers that actually had 3 women, which was unusual. And there was a lot of concern when I applied that I would be 4. It really was quite awful in a way, in that sense, that was a factor in the decision making. I hope that that's not the case now.
Yeah.
I mean, excuse me, sorry. I think in life generally, to hold down, I call it, or keep out of occupations, people because of their gender or their ethnic backgrounds or anything like that. You're just wasting human talent, actually. This is a bit off script, but I call it script, not that we have a script. But I went to the Institute of Computer Science in the States about 2 years ago, and I couldn't believe it. As I walked through the door, the first thing you see is the British flag and the great big portrait of Countess Ada Lovelace, daughter of Lord Byron, who was one of the first pioneers as you know. And going around the museum, so many data analysts had been women, and you just think over the years, how much talent do we use if we don't include people? And I do see a big difference. If you go to court now, you see a very big difference. And there's more to be done. But yes,
Yeah.
I do see a big difference, yeah.
Amina, what are your thoughts on it as a young female? You're from the BAME background as well. How do you find diversity in the sense that in your peers that are also studying?
I'd say there is a kind of unconscious bias that does exist.
Yeah.
Where people, it's just the way that they've been raised, that they just can't help to be a bit prejudiced.
Mm-hmm.
That does exist, definitely. A thing that I found when I was studying is that the majority of students, they're kind of just white, middle class.
You still find that now,
I still
even
find
today?
that, yeah. Middle class, upper class men who are from Oxbridge. I found that even when I was studying in London. And the majority of other students were kind of international, wealthy students. I think it was just me and another girl from Luton who I was the only kind of ethnic girl in my class in a few classes that I had. So it is an existing issue, but I guess it's a lot better than it was, you know?
And Leslie, do you think being a female, does that have much of an effect on the cases that you deal with? Do you find that your gender has played a part in maybe how people perceive you as a barrister or the kind of work that you get given?
I think that's difficult often to assess because I have had many cases that one would say might traditionally go to men. Blackmails, armed robberies, that sort of thing. I don't know to what degree solicitor selection is based on gender. I think nowadays clerks are very helpful, very advanced. I also have found recently solicitors very supportive. There was one lady, I was the only woman on a case, and the client questioned why he was the one, why do I have to have a woman?
Really?
And she was excellent. She didn't just say, oh yes, well of course I'll give you a man. She just said, don't you think you're being rather silly? And he said, maybe, yeah, okay. But I think sometimes this unconscious bias that Amina has mentioned is there often in what I call the lay client's mind, that they, if they're in a big drugs case, for example, and everyone else has got a male barrister, that they're, well, why have I got a woman?
Yeah.
And they're not always able to realise that you're there because of your intellect or,
Exactly.
not that your skill, if you hope that you have, So I personally don't feel I've been pushed or channeled into work to do with children. However, that's now. When I was starting in the 80s, that's all I got, family work, childcare,
Okay.
So I think times have changed. And I suppose, I've changed. As you go through the years, you get different skill sets, or you hope you improve on your skill sets. So,
were there a lot of men working in family in the 80s? Or was it just predominantly women?
Well, certainly it was a lot of women. Yeah. I did tend to find a lot of male barristers, particularly when it was ancillary relief, financial.
Yeah.
When it was the work to do with children, I certainly felt that it was more female dominated, if you call it, which can be quite unfair in men at times. There are many men who are excellent at cross-examining children or dealing with children. So I that's why I think people, we need to care about everybody, and we need to strive to make to try to eliminate these biases that you have spoken of.
So we have about 50 seconds or so before we're cutting off to the break. And just quickly before the break starts, do you have any advice for those people that are currently pursuing a legal career or wish to become a barrister or a solicitor? In the few seconds that we have before the advert.
I think work experience, building a network, just kind of, it's all about who you know.
Well, I agree with this work experience because face-to-face work in shops, anything that you're doing that you can communicate and get on with people. Also, if you have a language, use that because that's really valuable. So, sorry.
No, that's good advice. Okay, guys, so we're just going to take a quick break now and join us again soon for the second half of the show.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Atif Nawaz. Listen to Inspire FM shows in your time by heading over to inspirefm.org or listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Welcome back to the Ask Your Lawyer show. I am Tara Iqbal of Liberty Law Solicitors hosting this evening, and with me in the studio today we have Leslie Manley, who's a church court barrister, and we've also got Amina Karim, who is a bar student and a junior editor of GC Legal Magazine. For those of you just joining, before the break, we were discussing legal careers and routes into law, basically. And we also mentioned that in this half of the show, we will be discussing an important topic. We're going to now be speaking about consent. As defense lawyers, the issue of consent is something that we deal with time and time again. It is a difficult subject matter, but it is an important concept in law which affects everyone in society, and we want to educate people about what consent actually is. So we will be having a frank discussion about consent now. Amina, you have actually written 2 dissertations about consent and marriage and the like. And Leslie, you have over 25 years worth of experience prosecuting and defending serious offences. And dealing with cases obviously concerning consent. So just to kind of kick off, what is the legal definition of consent?
Well, it was never actually defined until 2003. There is now, it was given its general meaning before that, but now Section 74 of the Sexual Offences Act 2003 does give a definition of consent. And it says that for the purposes of this act, a person consents if she agrees by choice and has the freedom and capacity to make that choice. So that's the statutory definition of consent.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So by freedom and capacity, what exactly do you mean?
Well, you've got to have the mental ability to consent. You have not to be in a situation of being bullied, coerced, and you have to be over the age of 16.
Okay.
And there are special circumstances where if you, that's what I'd call for, I don't know if Amina would agree, the legal age of consent. However, there are people, doctors, teachers, you are not allowed to, what they call, you abuse your trust, the trust. If the person is 16 or 17, you should not be having sexual activity with them. But yes, the freedom and capacity to consent. So it's got to be proper consent.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned that the legal age of consent in the United Kingdom is 16 years old. Are you aware of what the youngest age of consent is? Which country?
Nigeria.
I think yes. I think you two told me that. Yes.
So in Nigeria, the legal age of consent is actually 11 years old. And what are your opinions on the legal age of consent in the UK. So do you think that it should be higher, or do you think that it should be lower? This is just your opinion.
I don't think I would change it. I think there are some arguments to lower it to 15 just because children are reaching puberty earlier, and that they're just engaging in kind of intimate acts a bit earlier than 16. But I think 16 is a pretty decent kind of age.
I would agree with Amina. Again, it's only my personal opinion, but I think given that it's not just about puberty, it's about your maturity, isn't it? And so, yes, I agree with Amina, but my opinion is it's Parliament have done it correctly. They'd be pleased to know. In my view,
We approve.
we approve.
So, can someone ever consent on your behalf?
No.
No?
No.
Never. No? Okay. Is silence ever considered consent?
No.
Had a bit of silence there.
The fact someone is silent cannot of itself be interpreted as giving consent in this context.
Okay.
We in the past there were various legal maxims, keeping quiet meant you consented and so forth, but that's not in this context. The fact that somebody doesn't say no loudly or just keeps quiet doesn't mean exactly
That they say yes, exactly.
exactly.
Right, okay. So I know you said in the past silence was sort of a form of acceptance. Are you aware of when this actually changed?
Oh, sorry. I don't think it's ever been a form of consent. In this. I was thinking, actually, just to digress, about the trial of Sir Thomas More, where he wouldn't speak.
So what can you tell us about that trial? Because obviously not all of our listeners would be aware of what happened or the facts of that case.
Well,
so he didn't speak.
Well, this is where Amina's history will be very useful. It was during the situation with Henry VIII when he was getting a divorce, or trying to get a divorce from Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. And everyone was required to swear an oath. And my memory, so listeners forgive me, is that Sir Thomas More would not, but he wouldn't say anything, and had the Latin maxim, silence means consent. So it's in that context, never in this context. So I wouldn't like to confuse anybody.
Intimacy,
or get anybody writing in outraged or whatever. No. It's the fact of somebody not protesting or anything is never in this context meant consent. Yeah.
So going off on that then, how do you know whether consent was actually given?
I think there's a couple of types of different consent. There's explicit and is it implied? Explicit is obviously when you say yes or no, and then implied it depends on the context, kind of things that are done or that might suggest something.
Yeah. Okay. And what does it mean by having reasonable belief that there is consent, Leslie? What can you tell me about reasonable belief?
Well, reasonable belief goes beyond just a genuine belief. It has to be reasonable in all the circumstances. So you might think a certain thing, you might genuinely think it, but it might not be reasonable. And all members of the public looking at that set of facts might think, yes, well, you genuinely believe that, but actually that's a very silly thing for you to have believed because it's just not rational, not reasonable in all the circumstances. Sometimes that will be what a jury trial will be about.
Okay.
the jury, as 12 citizens, will make that.
Was that reasonable?
Yes.
Does that go to the reasonable kind of man test? Is it to do with that? Like, what would a normal person on the street, would they think that's reasonable? Just because you think something's reasonable doesn't mean that kind of someone
That
else
it is, yeah.
Okay. Can you consent to anything whilst being intoxicated?
Well, you can, in the same way you can commit a crime when you're intoxicated, and you can be found guilty because a drunken intent is still an intent. Similarly, if you're intoxicated, you can consent. However, the degree to which you're intoxicated may mean you're not consenting, or and you don't have the freedom and capacity to consent. And this is why these cases are so difficult in court, because there are obvious situations when somebody can't stand up. You know, there's no way. They don't recognise who they're with. There is no way that they, whatever they say, will have got the capacity and freedom to genuinely consent. Equally, you might have someone who's had one glass of wine and who's actually still in a position, or maybe more than one glass, it depends on the person, but still in a condition to make an informed choice and decision.
Okay, and this might sound a bit absurd, but can you consent whilst asleep?
No.
No, you can't. And it's actually not an absurd question, actually, because there being cases considered in Canada in particular, and in Scotland, Mina probably knows more than I do because she's done her papers on them. And these whole questions, without going into details of the cases, but I have, can you consent in advance? And the answer really is no. That's the Canadian Scottish authorities. I have looked. I haven't found one here, but maybe there is one.
I don't think there is yet.
So you cannot consent whilst asleep. Leslie, you have special expertise in representing defendants with mental illness, mental impairment, and autism. Does having a mental disorder or a low mental age affect your ability to consent?
Well, again, it can do, and Parliament's recognised that, and I think it is Section 30 onwards of the Sexual Offences Act 2003, the same piece of legislation. I think it's Section 30 onwards that gives people specific protection, because obviously some people are very vulnerable. And I think the whole aim of the law in this area is that respect for yourself, respect for other people, and protection for those who are vulnerable. So yes.
Sorry.
No,
sorry. How might a person with a mental disorder or a low mental age meet the threshold of legal consent, or for legal consent?
Well, I don't really know that I can answer that, really. I think each case would be case specific and person specific.
Just depends on the facts of the case.
Yes, that's what. Yeah, I can't think off the top of my head of an example. Sorry.
No, that's fine. What happens if you consent to engaging in an activity, but then you later change your mind?
During or after?
So, let's say during.
Then you've revoked your consent, haven't you? You don't consent.
So you initially say, yes, I want to be involved in this, and then midway through you change your mind, so that your consent is no longer valid. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. What happens then if you consent to engaging in an activity, but you don't change your mind during the activity, rather you change your mind later, does that revoke your consent, and does your consent become invalid? Or what does that mean then if you later think, oh, do you know what? I don't think I wanted to do that.
What matters is what was happening at the time.
At the time.
If you were consenting at the time, you were consenting at the time. Yeah. People, being human beings, do things they regret.
I think that's what it is. It's not just that your consent is invalid anymore. It's more sort of just regret. Yeah. So your consent is still valid in the circumstances of when you change your mind after the activity or whatever takes place.
I mean, it doesn't stop people feeling upset and distress, but it is not the same as not having given consent in the first place.
Yeah, definitely not. What happens if you consent to something else, but the person misunderstood you and they did something that you did not consent to? What do you think?
I think that's very complicated.
So you kind of agreed to something, and then there was a miscommunication or something, and that person reasonably believed that you were consenting, but it wasn't quite what you thought, or it was something slightly different.
Did you make it known to the person that it wasn't what you expected it to be?
Is that what would have an effect then if you make it known at the time? Because that this isn't what I actually consented to.
Wouldn't that be a revocable consent?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, and if you don't make it known at the time, then...
Like, we're in that situation again where it's happened after.
Yeah. Okay, then it's more just sort of a regret. Okay. At court, must the prosecution prove that consent was not given, or is it a matter for the defence to prove that consent was given? So who does a burden of proof lie with?
Well, in a criminal trial of this sort, the burden of proof is always on the prosecution to prove every element of the offence. The burden does, and the standard is to make a jury satisfied so that you are sure the burden does not shift to the defendant in this sort of case.
Yeah. Okay. So, in terms of marriage, it was only until 1990 where consent was deemed to be automatically given within a marriage. What changed this?
I think it was the case of R&R. It was a woman who complained about her husband's advances, but they were married. So prior to this, the law was that because you're married, consent is automatically given, because essentially the law recognised that a wife was the husband's property. So it was a property kind of consent. After 1990, that was revoked, being that just because a prior relationship existed doesn't mean that consent was automatic. I think that's the main kind of gist of it.
Yeah. So in terms of consent in marriages now, what are your views on this?
I think it happened quite late on. 1990.
You think that the law should have changed earlier?
Yeah. I mean, it's quite archaic if you think about it. 1990 is, quite recent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just looking at the history. 1736.
Yeah.
Matthew Hale, former Chief Justice, he said the husband, it was always gender specific then, cannot be guilty on account of the matrimonial consent which she has given and which she cannot retract.
Yeah.
And as Amina said, it was really a property crime, and I think most people would actually be surprised that it was only towards the end of the last century that these cases, the law evolved in that way.
Yeah.
And again, I think is it the 2003 Act that actually specifies it now, so...
Why do you think it took so long?
I just think that so many things, society in the last century, and went through such a shift, and it is now we are in unprecedented times with, for instance, digital case systems, technology advancing beyond what everybody thought. And I think, you know, just in my own lifetime, my careers advice at school, such as one got then, was always, well, you will need some sort of job that fits around your children. You couldn't do certain financial things without male say-so. And there was this expectation of a way of life, and that was very entrenched, you know. Having children when you weren't married, you know, it was considered very shocking. Divorce was considered very shocking. But I also think that I don't think people realised the fact this all stemmed as a property crime in the first place.
So a lot has changed since then.
A lot's changed.
For the better.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a lot still to be done though.
Yeah, there are a lot of problems still in our society. One of them being actually society tends to victim blame. And usually this happens to women in the context of when women get, you know, sexually assaulted or raped. A lot of the time, or too often, a victim is asked insulting questions like, what were you wearing at the time of the offence? Does the way a person dress ever imply a willingness to do something or consent?
Never. No.
Let's just clear that up right now.
No.
No. So a person's outfit, it's just ridiculous, right? Yeah. So the way a person dressed does never imply consent or willingness or agreement to do something. Leslie, what can you tell me about what free consent means in law?
What, sorry?
Free consent?
Oh, well, it means, yes, that you have the freedom and capacity to consent. So you need to be old enough to know what you're doing.
Yeah.
You need to be mentally able to make that choice. Yeah. You need to be free, not bullied, not bossed about, not intimidated.
Yeah.
So is this where the idea of pressure comes in? If you're pressured to do something, then I guess you don't have free consent.
Yes. Well, also, the silence thing, but some people can't talk because they're too frightened of somebody. You know, they're too intimidated. So,
Okay. There is an assumption that the authorities consider men the suspects and women the victims. Leslie, since you've dealt with many sexual offences cases, what are your thoughts on this?
I don't think that the investigating authorities do necessarily think that. I know that's
just a generic sort of assumption,
but I have dealt with cases where the offenders are women. And I don't want to go into detail because I don't want to, but that they've been women. And so, but in the cases I've acted in, I have found them to have been investigated properly when a complaint's been made, even if the perpetrator's alleged to be a woman. I haven't ever heard of anyone saying, well, you know, that can't be right because she wouldn't do that. And so that's not been my experience. That is all I can say, that I've found things to be investigated properly.
I guess with those sorts of crimes, they're underreported anyway. So you can never kind of get a clear indication.
Understandable. Okay, so what are some examples of prison sentences that you can receive if you do something without obtaining prior consent?
Well, in advising a client what is going to happen to them, one no longer just has to rely on old case law and authorities. There's the guidelines from the Sentencing Guidelines Council, and you can look at them online, and it will
Nice bit of homework.
But again, I don't want to embarrass anybody listening by going through different types of offences, but it sets out very clearly what the offence is, what your culpability is, and that sort of thing, and that will tell you the sentencing bracket that you would expect if you broke the law in this way.
Yeah. And Amina, actually I think we're coming close to the end of the show. So yeah, it's coming near to the end of our time here. That was really fast. I want to say a massive thank you again to both Lesley and Amina for joining me on the show tonight. For those of you that want to get a hold of Lesley, you can contact her via Church Court Chambers or through our offices alternatively. I am Tariq Bell of Liberty Law Solicitors. I have been your host this evening. Until next time, guys, take care and good night.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Why not tune in to our live stream at inspirefm.org and follow and subscribe to our social media platforms at Inspire FM Luton.